Okay, we now welcome on to the show someone I am really excited to speak to. Matt Ridley, author and columnist, member of the House of Lords, board member of the awesome Human Progress, which you can check out at humanprogress.org, and author of the also awesome The Rational Optimist. So, Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Awesome. So in your recent Spectator article, which Pete and I absolutely loved, and everyone should read it. If you don't have a Spectator UK login, it's also available at Human Progress, I think. But anyway, you said that the 2010s were the best decade ever. Now, why is that?
Yeah, well, this came about because I wrote a book in 2010 called The Rational Optimist, saying the world had been getting better, not worse, and was likely to continue doing so. And that was quite a brave thing to say at the time, because the world was still trying to recover from a terrible, deep recession that some people thought might be the beginning of a Great Depression for the globe. But looking back 10 years later, I suddenly realized that actually the numbers suggest that this was the best decade ever, which is quite remarkable when you think how gloomy we were throughout most of it about everything from, from climate change to the Euro crisis to the wars in Ukraine to the wars in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. So Syria, I should have added to that. So a lot of bad things happened in the 2010s. But if you look at the main numbers on human progress, how many people were in poverty at the end of the decade compared with the beginning, that number roughly halves. If you look at child mortality, the greatest measure of misery anybody can think of, it continued its relentless fall. If you look at growth of incomes in Africa, the poorest continent, you see remarkable improvement. So if you look at humanity as a whole, this was a very, very good decade.
So, Matt, I didn't realise that actually that article was a bit of a victory lap for you. So congratulations on having those predictions being correct. Now, we hear a lot. Oh, actually, one of the things we loved about the article was that it said kind of in another way that we can have economic growth and we can have environmental protection. We have people like David Attenborough saying that you can't have that. We have Greta Thunberg saying we're in the beginning of a mass extinction and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. Is economic growth and the environment a zero-sum game, or do they help each other?
Right. Well, that's the issue that I specifically focused on in that recent article. To me, this is a remarkable and extraordinary phenomenon, which people are beginning to wake up to, namely that economic growth is the best hope for saving the environment. Now, that might seem paradoxical to people, and indeed I quote David Attenborough as saying, anyone who thinks that infinite growth on a finite planet is possible is either mad or an economist. That's intended as an insult to economists. But actually, I think he's wrong. And the reason for that is because as we grow, we use fewer resources, not more. The whole point of economic growth is to be more efficient in our use of resources. So if you take land, for example, we're using 68% less land to produce a given quantity of food averaged over the whole world as we did in the 1960s. That's an enormous improvement in the productivity of land, and it means we actually need less land now to feed 7 billion people than we needed to feed 3 billion people when I was born. That's a reduction in our demands on the planet, and it spares land for nature. Another example is water. If you take predictions made in the 60s and 70s for how much water we were going to need in the United States, this is specifically by now, we're using a lot less than that. And I also give the trivial example of a drinks can, an ordinary aluminium drinks can now contains 13 grams of aluminium. When they were first invented in the early 1960s, there were about 80 grams in a drinks can. It's getting thinner, it's getting smaller. We're using less steel in buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, the evidence suggests that the countries that are doing best in conserving and repopulating wildlife in their countrysides are the rich countries. It's the poor countries that are still cutting down forests and still seeing reduced numbers of animals and plants and so on.
And the thing for me is that when you have these environmentalists saying we need to put all these protections in place and stop the economic growth, it's, they're being their own worst enemies. If you're really concerned about conservation, then you need to get out of the way of the development of the free market to make these new industries.
Well, if you think about it, I have a rather glib way of putting this, which is that Why is it that wolves are increasing in number in the world, lions are decreasing, and tigers are now roughly holding their own? The tiger population is slightly inching up at the moment. And the reason is because lions live in poor countries, wolves live in rich countries, and tigers live in middle-income countries. And when you think about it, in Africa, a lot of wildlife is in competition with human beings. People are still having to go into the forests either to get bushmeat or to get firewood for cooking over and so on. If instead they were going to shops and they were getting their energy from gas or something like that, then there would be much less demand on natural habitats. And if you take the environmentalist prescription that we should all go back to nature and get in touch with nature and sort of live harmoniously in nature, 7 billion people going back to nature would be a disaster for nature. In fact, some of the worst extinctions, the biggest wave of extinction was caused by Stone Age people 10,000 years ago on arrival in the North American continent and the South American continent, and a little earlier than that in Australia, and in New Zealand and in Madagascar. As soon as human beings turn up, there's a wave of extinction of the so-called megafauna, the biggest beasts, a really spectacular extinction. And that's caused by, men with spears. You don't need high technology to have a huge impact on the environment. In fact, in many ways, high technology helps you avoid having a high impact on the environment.
This kind of viewpoint for a lot of people, particularly young people in Australia and around the world, would be absolutely mind-blowing. Like, it's just not the argument that you hear very often. Given so many column inches and so much attention is given to climate issues, and particularly here in Australia, we've just had these bushfires, and I can tell you it is absolutely dominating the news cycle. How come, or can you give us a little bit of an insight as to maybe why this is such a rare message and why this is such a hard sell to environmentalists to convince them of this?
As a general rule, bad news sells. And for as long as human beings have been around, prophets of doom have been listened to more than optimists. You go right back to the golden age of Greece itself in the Bronze Age, in the early Iron Age. They're lamenting the loss of innocence of the modern world. They're saying it's getting worse, etc., etc. And so every generation has people saying, okay, it's got better so far, but it's about to get a lot worse. So there is nothing new in this telling young people that the world is doomed. And I often say to young people, when I was your age, in the early 1970s, when I was a teenager, I was very, very worried about the future of the world. I was quite interested in all these issues, and I was extremely terrified because the grown-ups told me that the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, cancer epidemic caused by the chemicals that we were putting into the environment was going to shorten our lives, the deserts were advancing, the forests were retreating, the ozone layer was disappearing, acid rain was killing the forests, sperm counts were falling. Every conceivable environmental scare was getting worse and worse and worse. And the prospects for my future were pretty gloomy. And actually, if you go back and look at the books written at the time by people like Paul Ehrlich, best-selling books, Robert Heilbronner wrote a book saying, the outlook for man is bleak. I read this stuff. And it scared the daylights out of me. I thought, oh my God, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Or I don't know what kind of job I'm going to get. There aren't obviously going to be any jobs. I believed it. And I never heard adults saying, you know what? Instead of that, it's possible that the world might get richer and cleaner, and we might reduce the rate of extinctions, which we have. The number of extinctions has been going down pretty spectacularly in the last few decades because of the work of conservationists. So what I'm trying to tell to young people is don't believe every gloomy prognostication, because there's a huge vested interest of the news media in appealing to people's pessimisms. And do remember that we can, the whole point is we can solve some of these problems. We don't have to have a council of despair. And at the moment, we seem to be telling young people about climate change that there is only bad news, that there is not a possibility of solving this problem. And I simply don't believe that. I think, A, we're exaggerating the problem, and B, we're underestimating the power of ingenuity to deal with the problem.
Yeah, I think it goes even further than climate change. Like I had this when I was, when I read your book and was talking about it with friends, and then I'm getting it again now when I've just finished Enlightenment Now, the Steven Pinker book, and I'm talking about that with friends. And I've been doing this thing where I just say to them, what do you reckon the life expectancy around the world is? And not a single person I've talked to has overshot the mark. Like I've heard 40, I've heard 50, I've heard 55, but no one has ever gone above it, which is 71.7. Like I just think this relentless pessimism is not just climate change. It's like it goes out into literally every way of measuring where life is going.
Yeah, well, Hans Rosling, who is something of a godfather to both myself and Steve Pinker in terms of getting to this point about optimism before us as a writer. Sadly, he died a few years ago, but Hans Rosling did a rather brilliant experiment before he died, which was to ask 1,000 people, initially in the US, but it was repeated in other countries, what, in the last 20 years, do you think that the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty has doubled, halved, or stayed the same? So that's three possible answers. And about 65% of people said they thought it had doubled, that there were twice as many people in extreme poverty today as 20 years before. And only 5% thought it had halved. Well, the 5% are right. It has halved in that time, roughly speaking. But Rosling then said, if I wrote those three answers on 3 bananas and threw them into a cage with a chimpanzee in it and measured which banana was picked up by the chimpanzee first, it would get the right answer 33% of the time, whereas human beings are only getting the right answer 5% of the time. How is it possible that human beings know more about the state of humanity? Than chimpanzees know more about the state of humanity than human beings do.
They are a very smart animal.
This is a ridiculous situation. And of course, the answer to his question is because it's not what we don't know that's transfixing us, but what we know for sure that ain't so. We persuade ourselves of things that we think are facts, but in fact are not.
It sort of goes a little bit deeper than that. I think with the environmentalist movement not accepting that optimistic story, often I find they've stood in the way of things that would make things better for the planet. For example, nuclear power has almost no emissions.
GM crops.
Yeah. Exactly right. Going to use far less land for agriculture. What do you think that is, and where do you think that comes from?
Right. Well, in the case of GM crops, I mean, I've just written a passionate article about golden rice, which is this wonderful invention 20 years ago by Ingo Petraikas in Switzerland of a vitamin-enhanced variety of rice that could help deal with enormous numbers of people who are going blind and dying in urban settings in Asia mainly, where they rely on rice for diet and they end up vitamin A deficient and their immune system is compromised as a result. Now, the sole and principal opposition to this over the last 20 years, which has been very effective and very powerful, has come from Greenpeace. Why would you want children to go on dying? I just don't understand the mentality that says that. And it's not as if GM crops have proved to be bad for the environment. Quite the reverse. The amount of pesticide used is down by about 37% on average around the world wherever GM crops are introduced. The yields are up, so you need less land. This is a good news technology, and yet environmentalists have opposed it every step of the way. They oppose shale gas extraction, fracking, their latest campaigns. And yet this is the cleanest of the fossil fuels. It's done a terrific job of displacing coal in North America. And it comes from a very small piece of land, so it doesn't need as much land as a lot of the renewables do. It doesn't need as much mining to support its activities. So I'm sorry, but the environmental movement is often actually making environmental problems worse. I mean, in Europe, we had the case where environmentalists pushed for diesel as a way of getting carbon dioxide emissions down. That resulted in worse air quality than we would otherwise have had if we'd stuck to petrol engines and so on. So somebody has to call out these very big, very powerful organizations. I mean, the big three, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and World Wildlife Fund, between them have something like $1 billion a year in income. These are giant multinational corporations with well-paid chief executives and big treasury functions and all the usual things that come with Goldman Sachs-like operations. But unlike those businesses, they don't have to actually produce products. Their product is fear and alarm and therefore donations. It's a virtuous circle. And I think, people have got to start standing up to these organizations and stop treating them as somehow virtuous. I don't think they are virtuous. I think they're genuinely dangerous.
Yeah, I would combine exactly what you're saying about Golden Rice, which, by the way, that was an awesome article, with the stuff we were talking about at the start of the interview where we talk about this hostility to economic growth. I mean, maybe there's some sort of definition breakdown, but when I hear economic growth, I think of poor people getting out of poverty, and this idea that we should it's this frivolous side thing, I just think is disgusting. But if you're against economic growth, if you're against the stuff that gets people out of poverty, and then you're also against Golden Rice, which stops, children being blind, I don't know how you can have that vision unless you started to think that humans were innately, they operated against the planet. They're a virus on this planet, and you don't want to help them proliferate.
Well, there is a strong streak of misanthropy in the environmental movement, whereby anything human beings do or invent is a bad thing, and that seems to me a pity. In the round, you can't deny that by inventing industrial civilization, we've enabled more people to live on the planet, and that does have pollution consequences and so on. But we've dealt with them. We've made the air cleaner, the water cleaner, etc. And I actually think that if you look at the numbers, if you look at this extraordinary reduction in the amount of stuff we need, and countries like the UK and the US are now using less stuff overall every year. If you look at minerals, metals, and fuels produced and imported, the number is going down, even though the population is still going up and wealth is still going up. It's possible to see a future in which by the end of this century, there are 8, 9, 10 billion people, whatever it is, living with a lighter imprint on the planet than they do today, with a lot more land released for nature, with much larger national parks, with not only very many fewer species going extinct, but also some species brought back from extinction by genetic technologies and so on. So I actually have a vision of a really fantastic environmental future as a result of technology, as a result of innovation. And on the whole, innovation is good for the environment, not bad. That much is abundantly clear from the last 2 centuries.
Now, Matt, your next book is out in May. It's called How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Can you give us a taste of what you're looking at in that one? Well,
I've decided it's time to look at innovation as a whole, what it is, why it happens to us and not to rabbits and rocks. It's a surprisingly mysterious process, I've decided. I've concluded, because we know it's important. It's a huge part of everyday life. We get used to having new consumer gadgets all the time. Where do they come from? Who comes up with these ideas? What's the process by which it emerges? It's a much more collective, much more distributed process than we tend to give it credit for. We say so-and-so invented something and he's a genius and he deserves a Nobel Prize and a patent. Actually, that's very misleading. Most of these things are the result of people collaborating and combining ideas. It's a process of recombination of ideas that produces all this. And it's an inexorable, inevitable process. But what I'm trying to do in this forthcoming book is just tell stories about all the innovations that have altered our lives not all, but many innovations that have altered our lives, and draw lessons as to what's happening and what this mysterious process of innovation is. And I've had a lot of fun writing the book, and I hope people are going to enjoy reading it when it comes out in May.
I absolutely can't wait to read it. Matt Ridley, people have got to go out. They've got to read this article. They've got to read your essay on Golden Rice. And they've got to definitely read The Rational Optimist if they haven't already. Thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Great to talk to you, and my best to everyone at the IPA.